So greetings, everyone. Welcome to our podcast. We have a delicious entree in our mental nutrition series today, and it's about the pandemic. I was challenged by our son, who said, "Hey, you ought to deal with some of the real issues that people are facing," and so that's what we're going to do today. And with me is Dr. Christopher Ebbe. Chris and I go back a long way. I was tabulating the years, Chris. I think it was, goodness, 45 years, and we were together in Spain, actually, and have maintained that contact for all these years, which is very rich for me. Anytime you can hold on to a contact. So we're going to talk about the pandemic. Chris is a clinical psychologist, very well versed, very well written, and states things very well. And so Chris, just part of our conversation here, the issues that we face for this unprecedented event in our lives, what are you seeing?
Well, I think there are several, and I'd like to just summarize them first, and then maybe we can dig further into them if you like. First of all, people at all ages, I think, as a result of this pandemic, have lived for a period in fairly constant fear and anxiety about illness and death. While the risks for actually dying were quite small for most of the population, still the event of dying would be cataclysmic. And so thoughts about losing loved ones, particularly parents, children, grandparents, that sort of thing, are really distressing. And to live with that 24 hours a day kind of casts a pall over everything else. And it challenges us to really work on attitude and what we really believe about ourselves and about life. Maybe we can expand on that later. I think the pandemic has also disrupted many of the factors that we use to organize our lives, and we don't realize, perhaps, as we're living them, how important that is in terms of our routines, schedules, our habits, the structures that we create to really keep our concerns, our fears in check, ultimately. And that disruption then adds to our possibilities for anxiety. There's a reduction in face-to-face contacts for people, most especially, I think, for adolescents, for whom those peer contacts are especially important in a lifestyle developmental sense. And while they could still continue with electronic contacts, I assume, I believe personally that the face-to-face contact, being able to give somebody a hug or those kinds of things, count for a lot. And so that's a loss that people have experienced. Then we might just add here the general stress of change. This has caused a lot of change in people's lives. Kids not going to school, people working from home, people losing jobs and income, all those kinds of things. Those changes all add to our stress level. And so that's a summary, in my view, of the general effects.
What about, Chris, what about just the general loss of control? I had a conversation with a couple folks several days ago, and they were talking about how the government controls us. And I said, well, yeah, there are some things the government mandates in order to help us get through this pandemic. And there are things that we can control. But I know just the sense of loss of control, when we feel that, is certainly an impediment to our growth and development and leading the normal life. Your thought on that?
I think that's a good point, John. In my notes here, I've cited that this kind of experience, and this applies to any really huge impact on one's life. Experiencing the sinking of a ship you're on, or being in a concentration camp, all those kinds of things bring up or highlight for us the true lack of control that we have. As I said, we substitute with schedules and routines and kind of the settledness of life. But in fact, these things can happen, and we certainly could experience this pandemic thing again. But it really points up that in the long run, ultimately, we're fairly helpless about many of these things, and we don't like that. We prefer to be in control and not to have the anxiety of the helplessness. And helplessness, just incidentally, as a psychologist, I think is one of the emotions that we work hardest to avoid in our lives. So that helplessness in the background, I believe, adds to the things I was citing before.
Yeah, I mean, we're gonna get to the to some suggestions on things that we can do, people can do to avoid that sense of helplessness. But I was struck with a number of quotes and some articles and some data about the effects of the pandemic. You were mentioning adolescence. There was a mother who said that the computer is no substitute for the classroom. And that's that face-to-face piece that you alluded to. I know here in our state of Colorado, there were a number of surveys done across the state. And I just would read from one here that 7 out of 10 teens said they were struggling with their mental health. 55% experiencing anxiety, 45 excessive stress, and about 45 with depression. And then there was a local school board that did a survey of their students, and 90% of them said that I'm not doing great right now. And this is the adolescent piece that you referred to. Thoughts on that from the adolescent perspective?
I don't have much to add to that. I just think that adolescents are trying hard to establish their own lives, how they might be outside of the family. And the more then that they're confined in the home, unable to go out, unable to have really free interaction with their friends because they're still at home, that takes away from those experiences. And I just reinforce what you said about the pall that this casts over lives, including our adolescents.
Yeah, and from a parental perspective too, I mean, parents having to be at home, or in some cases, leave the child alone at home. Hopefully, that doesn't happen with the younger kids. There's a particular need for the very young kids, and I'm talking about kindergarten and maybe first, second, third grade, where a lot of social development occurs. And when you put that on the parent to make that happen, then wow, parental pressures, uh, what's that do to the parent in your estimation?
Yes, I'm sure that while we've seen some positive reports in print and through the news about um, parents um, enjoying the opportunity to do more things as a family. I suspect that the net result for many families was more negative than positive, as parents are stressed in their own ways about maintaining survival for the family, for instance, and the additional concerns about, well, how do I parent? I think many parents these days don't do a lot of parenting because work takes up so much time, and then the things that we add in terms of organizations or social events just for adults um, really mean that that the interaction between parents and children is kind of superficial much of the time. So this has been a real challenge for uh, do I really like my kid? Does my kid really like me?
I
and
love them. Come on.
right. So I think that has been a special challenge.
But what about I read a quote from a lady who said, in fact, I have the quote here, um, and she said, "I encourage families to stop waiting for things to return to normal. It's a recipe for failure. There's probably not going to be a back to what we know as normal." Your reaction to that?
Well, I think that's a good point. Yes, we'd like to imagine in our fantasy that this will be over. We'll have beaten the virus with our vaccines and our herd immunity. But I think realistically, the virus is going to be there in the mud, in the animals, in some of our pets. And when it has an opportunity, particularly because we now, I think we know, I hope I'm not misunderstanding this, that even as vaccinated people, the virus can still take an initial hold in our nasal passages or whatever, and that because of that, we can still theoretically spread it to others, including those that haven't been vaccinated and those who have. So, in this very minor sense, I suspect that this will just be an additional health challenge for us as a species, and there'll be other viruses too.
Yeah, I mean, there's information coming out now from several states where there's now a spike in the number of COVID cases, whether that's due to spring break or whatever. We're not quite sure. I know in our state here, Colorado, we're making very good progress. The people are still pretty considerate with masking up and some social distancing. We are getting out more into the restaurants and things like that. Uh, the data is just suggesting that, hey, folks, we aren't quite ready yet to launch everything and open everything up. We're getting there. So
Yes, and I didn't address really your point there, your last point, which is given that we're not going to go back to exactly the normal we had, that we really should put some energies toward how do I want my life to be? How do I want my family to be interacting? Because there's opportunity here for guilt-free change, so to speak. Because to make the best of the situation, and that's one of the important points, I think, when we talk about how we can help both ourselves and others, is to be creative, to wonder about the quality of life, and given our new situation, what can we adjust or try in terms of new things to make things as good as we can.
well, that's a good transition, Chris. you're always good at good transition. So uh, into so what can we do? I mean, okay, we know about the pandemic, the control issues that we may have, then everything that we're faced with. We walk into a grocery store or whatever, and most people are masked up, but there's somebody without a mask. How dare you not wear a mask? And, we kind of look at them crosswise, if you will. And there are people who are doing well. I read a note about a young teenager. I think she's like 15 years old or so, and she tutors other kids online as a way of volunteering or giving back or helping others. And maybe as a starting point here, we can talk a little bit, Chris, about relationships and the importance of relationships and what can we do to develop or to maintain relationships that we have. Thoughts?
Well, I might step back even one step before your question and just say that I think in this kind of a challenge, our attitude about things, our overall attitudes are what counts the most. And so, regarding the people in the store who aren't masking or whatever, this is a chance um, to think of people in terms of what their struggles are. And I think many of the people that have resisted masks, well, it may have started out that, they didn't want to be the villain playing cowboys and Indians way back in their childhoods. But I think more importantly, there's a resistance to the control that you mentioned. They're not going to control my life, and but they're struggling with change, obviously too, and hurting. And so might be a chance for us to cultivate a little more compassion within ourselves, particularly reflecting on the fact that we know our struggles if we've been paying attention. And we're no different from other people. They're no different from us. This isn't conservative, liberal differences or even age differences. Everybody is having many of the same problems with this. And so it's a chance to help our kids view that also, that people's behavior may look strange or erratic or counterproductive, but there are reasons for that, if we are willing to think about it.
Yeah, you mentioned attitude. We did a podcast several weeks ago, and it's online. One of the earlier podcasts we did, and it was about the what I call a positive brain, and how do you develop a positive brain? And sometimes people say, well, the world isn't all that positive. And I say, well, I understand if you read the news every day. There's a colleague of ours, Chris, a guy named Andrew Weil, W-E-I-L, and he's a Harvard-bred MD, and he's a best-selling author. And he talks about natural healing, and he talks about toxins in our life. And he says, for example, the news can be a toxin. And if you read the newspaper, if you watch the news diligently every day, then there's not always a lot of good news. They're highlighting what's wrong. More deaths from COVID, problems in this part of the country or this part of the world, and mass shootings, and it's like, what's going on here? And it can be a toxin, it can be a downer. And what is it that we can do to build a positive brain? And I let people know that it's a challenge, because we hear that negative input so much more loudly than we hear a positive input. And so there's a bit of a battle there. And yet there are techniques that we can use. And I'll be interested in your comments on this, to build the positivity, to back to your point about developing an attitude toward this, an attitude of hope.
Well put, John. I think that the two, sort of summarizing all of my experience as a clinical psychologist, the two things that we should focus on that are most helpful to having we call it good attitude, a positive attitude about life and those are, one, how we feel about ourselves. If we like ourselves, if we think well of ourselves, despite our flaws and our mistakes, but we have basically that we feel good about being who we are. And then number two, that we pay attention to our achievements. And when most people hear that, they think, well, your college degree or your status or your income, but that's not really most of what we do. I mean, every day you get up and do your thing, whether that's going to school or to your job and doing the best you can. You are contributing to your family or to larger groups or to the nation in some way, some small way, but still contributing. If we recognize that those are the important things, how did our kids go to bed feeling, tonight? How did, what one thing did I do during the day to really add to my spouse's good feelings about herself? Those are the things that count. And yet we sort of pass over that. We only look at the fame and fortune kinds of things. But I think that feeling good about who you are and then recognizing the good that you're doing in the world, and that you do that day after day, it's pretty reliable, despite, again, we may have down days or have the flu sometime, but we're pretty reliable as human organisms. And to just recognize and appreciate that about ourselves, I think those are the two keys to ultimately to having a generally positive attitude.
Yeah, that's that self-compassion. I just was part of a leadership development program that we're doing. It's ongoing. And I said to the group the other day that you can be your own worst enemy, because you're constantly critiquing you. And now, good constructive criticism about ourselves, that's okay. There's nothing wrong with that. However, we tend, to your point, to kind of look at what we don't have, and rather than what we do have. And I'm not talking about toys or things, I'm talking about the contributions we make, relationships with others, those kinds of things. When we talk about, so self-compassion is just an awful big deal. When we look at our belief in ourselves, I often say to folks, if you were rating your confidence level on the old 1 to 10 scale, where 10 is I'm supremely confident, and 1 is, I don't like myself at all, where would you rate yourself? I don't give me a 10, as I'm still learning. And yet, be careful about being too tough on yourself. So when it transitions to relationships, to your point now, Chris, when you said, take a look at yourself, your attitude, and when you develop some good feelings, you're more likely to connect with others, to help them out. So that's where social media, for example, can come in. Right now, we're doing this Zoom thing, and there are all these other, I don't know what they all are, Instagram and Snapchat and Twitter and on, ways to connect with each other. And admittedly, it's not face to face. However, it does establish a system of connectivity with others. And relationships are a big deal. For me, at least, that's something that's awful important. So that's something. We were talking earlier about a lack of control. Well, what about those things we do control? And I'll have you speak to that. When you get up in the morning, what do? There are things you control, and as we're talking here, Chris, I'll ask you about what else? What else can we do to help us cope with this and continue to build our lives?
The important point, just to take what we've just been saying a step further, is that when you feel good about yourself and pretty happy about how you're managing your life, then you're much more in a better position to spread that attitude to others. We both convey it non-verbally as well as verbally and in our other actions. And the more compassionate we can be toward others. Because if we're feeling in a deficit position, or a negative position, we don't have as much to give. So that's why I'm emphasizing this attitude as the key to all of it, because it affects how we interact with those on a Zoom call, how we interact with our kids at home and their annoyances and things like that. And I think it flows. If you can establish that sense of medium confidence anyway, and above neutral feeling about yourself, then you're in a position to act on those, just carry those into everything that you do.
Yeah, well, there are also a lot of practical suggestions, some of which we've done podcasts on, like sleep. Get sufficient sleep, 7 to 9 hours. Just an important dynamic. Move, do some exercise. We did a podcast on that. Get up, move around the house, go outside. In terms of connectivity, go say hi to your neighbor. Check on your neighbor. You can call them, and you can volunteer to do things. All of this is keeping you busy. If you're feeling all stressed out about this, Google a meditative technique, which is called mindfulness. I engage in that each day a bit. And it's helpful keeping this mind working well. So the point is there are lots of things that we can do to keep us focused on having some kind of control in our life. Another is what makes you happy, and do you do that? And some people say, well, I can't. Well, maybe you can. You made a point half an hour ago about paying attention to those things that we have some control over, and I translate that into all this positive brain and all these other things that I just mentioned. Anything else that you would add in terms of what we can do? People listening to this, whether they're a parent, an educator, we haven't touched on educators, they have a tough grind, or that sort of thing. Anything else that you can think of that you might add as we come toward the end here?
And those are all excellent points that you were making about, but just maybe just gather that together. We can make ourselves feel better, in effect, to some extent, by acting the part. It might sound unfair, but to recognize that everything we do, every choice we make, impacts our sense of how we feel about ourselves and our lives, means that to get up and walk around the house or go for a walk around the block, to actually do those things, even though you might not feel like doing them, has a positive impact on you. And those are the building blocks of that positive brain you're talking about. So even when in our down times, or we're not particularly feeling great, to choose to go ahead and take care of business like that, get the sleep, get the exercise, get the contact with somebody, even if it's just saying, hi, how are you? Those are all positive building blocks that we should use. But what it leads to come back to your current question, is that human beings feed on each other's attitudes, and we read those pretty accurately, non-verbally. Somebody's sad, somebody's confident, somebody's mad. And for us to be in a calm, gathered, confident place, as confident as is realistic to be, that transmits to other people. And so one of the best things I think we can do for each other is to have that attitude and just live being ourselves, being the best person we can be, and that being okay. So there's an element of acceptance involved here too. Yes, there's a lot we can do, and there are some things we don't control. We can't existentially, we don't know when we're going to die, etc. And so recognizing and accepting that that's okay. Yes, it's okay to be a human being with all our amazing capacities, as well as our notable helplessnesses. That acceptance is important in the end, and it helps us to stay centered in that positive attitude, because life is worth living.
Well, I'm with you on that one, and that's perhaps a central tenet for folks to realize, is to start off with, hey, life is worth living. There is hope. We are moving toward conquering this COVID pandemic, and so there's lots of things we can do. For folks interested, a number of the things Chris and I have talked about, there are a whole series of podcasts where we addressed some of these topics, and you can get it through our website and YouTube, and going to Mental Nutrition, Dr. John Anderson. And so, hey, Chris, I want to thank you for being a part of this today. The pandemic is certainly something that's on everybody's mind. And maybe we drew out a thought or two for people to consider. So well done, my friend. Good to see you. And look forward to continuing our contact.
Yes, me too. Thank you, John.
And folks, we'll talk to you on the next podcast, which, interestingly enough, is going to be on mindfulness. So look forward to connecting with you on any of our podcasts. So you folks have a good day. Give yourself a hug. You deserve it.